Hey friends, have you been blessed or encouraged or challenged by Theology in the Raw? If so, would you consider joining Theology in the Raw's Patreon community? For as little as $5 a month, you can gain access to a diverse group of Jesus followers who are committed to thinking deeply, loving widely, and having curious conversations with thoughtful people. We have several membership tiers where you can receive premium content. For instance, silver level supporters get to ask and vote on the questions for our monthly Patreon only podcast. They also get to see like written drafts of various projects and books I'm working on, and there's other perks for that tier. Gold level supporters get all of this and access to monthly Zoom chats where we basically blow the doors open on any topic they want to discuss. All of my patrons play a vital role in nurturing the mission of Theology in the Raw. And for me, just personally, interacting with my Patreon supporters has become one of the hidden blessings in this podcast ministry. So you can check out all of the info at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. All right, friends, you ready for this one? My guest today is Ryan, who is a Canadian police officer trained in advanced alcohol and drug impairment recognition, which includes being a certified drug recognition expert. He's passionate about following God and working about how to apply God's wisdom and rules for life to the poverty, addiction, and justice issues that he encounters every single day as a police officer. This episode arose because Ryan, who's an avid podcast listener, reached out to me after my conversation with Todd Miles about Christians and marijuana use. And while he agreed with a lot of what Todd had to say, he also had some disagreements that do come from his very informed background. So I was like, hey, let's have a conversation. And then, if you wouldn't mind, let's record that conversation and, maybe post it on the podcast. So that's where we are today. So I am excited for you to get to know Ryan's somewhat different take on Christians and marijuana use. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this important topic. So this, just to explain to my audience, this arose because I think it was a month ago when I had Todd Miles on to talk about Christians and marijuana. And, he's written a book on it. He's primarily a theologian, biblical scholar. And so he looked at it from a kind of a Christian scholarly perspective, but he did a lot of research also on some of the science behind it. And this whole topic's just really new to me. And so I just, come at it as a learner. Shortly after that was released, you reached out to me, said, while you appreciated the episode, you felt like there were several things that you felt like maybe you would find some maybe disagreement / maybe supplement or give kind of a different view on some things. So that's how this conversation arose. And I said, well, hey, do you want to come on the podcast and talk about this? And you were like, no, but let me think about it. So here we are. So thanks so much, Ryan, for coming on the podcast to talk about this controversial topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so I list your credentials and stuff in the show notes so people can check that out. But maybe just explain verbally, what is it that you do and how it relates to this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a police officer here in Canada. I've taken a lot of specialized training as far as alcohol and drug impairment detection. So primarily that is focused on driving impairment. So I can operate what people would think is a breathalyzer. So you're drunk, you go back to the station, you give a breath sample, and it kind of says if you're drunk. For a long time, that was kind of the status quo. And actually, I should say I'm a police officer in Canada, so a lot of stuff that I may say, I know you have probably mostly U.S. listeners, so there's probably going to be some discrepancies between in some of the details that I portray because we have a different law here. But as far as the conversation context is concerned, in impairment, it's going to be applicable across the road. And when I say impairment, in my mind, that is you're drunk, you're high, and I can demonstrably show that. So how I can do that is with alcohol specifically. Basically, we've decided. Have you heard of the over 80 rule?
No,
for over 80, you're drunk. Okay, so
that's just maybe how fast I drive, but yeah.
Yeah. No. So, and I know this is a standard in a lot of states, but here in Canada, if you have over 80 milligrams of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood, you are drunk. And what they say is there's lots of studies supporting that at that level, everybody is drunk. It doesn't mean that a lot of people are not drunk below that. It means that's the criminal standard of no, there's no possible way that you are not drunk at that
Okay.
level. Okay. The problem in the 70s that they started running into is they started getting people coming in that the officers could see you're very impaired. You should not be driving a car. But when we put you on a breathalyzer, you're only blowing 10 or 15. And they go, you can barely stand. You can't form words together, and you crashed a car. What's going on? And they really quickly realized, well, it's drugs. People are maybe drinking a little bit of alcohol, but they're taking their pot, their cocaine, whatever it is, alongside that. So they needed to adjust and figure out how do we actually deal with this, because this is a really serious situation. People are dying every day because of it. So what do we
Mm.
do? So they formed the Drug Recognition Expert Program, which is officers go through, take significant training in how different drug classes affect the body, what happens, how they interact with each other, and then there's a standardized set of tests that you put people through with their cooperation, obviously, and we can determine what drug class those people are impaired by and whether or not they're impaired. So the important part of this conversation for me is when I heard Todd, which you did a really good intro. I really appreciate the scientific work he put into it. And where I started differing was that there is a difference between drug use and being actually impaired by that drug, having your decisions significantly affected by that.
Can
And this
you?
is where I start to bring those two conversations in together.
Okay.
Is that if you have a glass of wine for supper or a beer or something like that, there's nobody that's going to be drunk from that. You might get a little bit of a buzz if it's a really hot day or something like that and you haven't had much, but in my mind, you're not impaired, and biblically, you're not drunk. From the wisdom perspective that Todd really articulately talked about. You're able to make decisions. You have your moral judgments intact, right? But then what happens when you have 2 beers or 3 beers, or what happens when you are on antidepressants and you have 1 or 2 beers? What happens when you do take a quick smoke from a joint and you're at a campfire and everybody's got a joint and pass it around? Well, are you actually impaired at that point? Are you drunk per se? Is your decision making ability inhibited by that drug? And so that's one of the things I differ on, is that I would say that no, just using cannabis or using marijuana inherently does not mean that you are impaired and that your decision making ability is bad.
Okay. So you would okay, so this is so funny. I wasn't even sure where you're gonna go with. I don't know if you're gonna be like totally pro smoking pot for Christians or maybe more against it. So I didn't know what side of Todd's kind of perspective you'd land on. So I guess to summarize, and then I want to hear your thoughts. So for those who maybe didn't listen to the episode, I would encourage them to maybe go back and listen to it. But Todd made the distinction, which I think a lot of people make, between recreational use of marijuana and medicinal use. And he was, for the most part, pro medicinal, more anti recreational. And the main reason is because, unlike alcohol, where you can have a glass of wine and you're not drunk, if you do get high, you're kind of either high or you're not. It's kind of like, you don't have that kind of in between stage where you can responsibly, smoke a few joints or whatever. You're totally fine. You just kind of go from zero to like not high to high. If I hope I'm summarizing his perspective correctly. Not even, I said, aren't there some exceptions to that? Like, you'll hear certain popular podcasters, getting high while podcasting or whatever. And it's like, you didn't even know it. Like sometimes you're like, wow, they seem really coherent. So, and now I said, aren't there different kind of body, certain people that can actually smoke a joint and not get impaired by, being high in the classic sense of the term. So anyway, that was kind of the summary of what we talked about. So can you, in response maybe to how I'm summarizing it, unpack your position or maybe a where you might disagree with him on that?
Yeah, for sure. So where I would disagree from kind of a top level on what Todd said was that you can use cannabis recreationally and it does not impair your judgment.
Okay.
And why I say that is in the drug recognition process, yes, we have to determine what kind of drug the person is actually impaired by in order to go to court and say, yeah, this person shouldn't be driving a car here. They need to have consequences for that. They need to know better. But the other part of it is that I actually have to prove that they're actually impaired. And that's where it comes back to, is this the equivalent of 2 beers that they had? And okay, yeah, they've got it on board, but no, they're not actually impaired by it. I can see a little bit of physiological signs that yes, they have some cannabis on board, but no, they're doing everything just fine. I think they actually are able to drive a vehicle. They are able to make good judgment calls. They're not again high or drunk per se. And so, and to specify, I don't use cannabis recreationally. I use
that's what people are thinking.
CBD.
They're like, oh, this guy is some pothead Canadian police officer. He probably grows his own up there. Who knows what they're doing up
no,
there
I should clarify. I use CBD for some medical stuff, and I found like incredible effects. But I specifically find the low THC because I just have personally no interest. But I also have no moral issue with people using recreational cannabis. In the same way,
it's because you're saying people can't have THC in their system and not be impaired, so it wouldn't be in the biblical category of being, drunk or losing your control of your moral sensibilities. You would say there's a certain level of THC in your system that wouldn't necessarily be in that category.
Yes, and that's exactly it. For me, because I kind of have to look at it if I know, which I know because of my expertise, that having THC and using it in your system doesn't inherently impair your decision making, what is a problem with that? Why would that be wrong and using alcohol be fine? Because in my mind, especially in my like drug recognition program, there's similar things. They're both mind-altering substances. And if you take that to the nth degree, which I think actually Todd talked about a little bit, caffeine is a mind-altering substance. There's all sorts of mind-altering substances. So where I really firmly agree with him is that this is a wisdom issue. This is not a use or do not use. This is firmly in the wisdom category. And we can expand. Todd did a really good job of talking about that. But I think that understanding using cannabis doesn't necessarily impair you is a really important part of the conversation.
What does it do? Like if you take a certain level of THC that isn't leading to full like impairment, what are the effects? Is it just calming? Is it, more like, like maybe drinking a glass of wine at night where you kind of feel a little more relaxed or whatever. Is it similar to that or?
Yeah. And again, coming from someone that's speaking third party, because I've never actually done it myself. This is all just kind of physiological observations. It generally chills people out. Pot's actually a super weird category of drug compared to a lot of other ones because it's got some calming effects, and yet it's also got some stimulating effects. So it's like this really wild card. You talk about cocaine or meth or something, methamphetamine or something like that, and it just amps you right up. Like it just takes you through the roof. You're jittery. You're doing all sorts of stuff. As compared to alcohol or fentanyl or something like that, it really drops you way down there. Like opioids are kind of a sort of a depressant. Alcohol is definitely a depressant. It chills you out. Pot does a little bit of both. And so, yes, for most people, it chills you right out. But it also can heighten your awareness even while it dampens your decision-making abilities, kind of getting into the impairment levels. So what most people feel is, they feel is, they're just chill, but they don't get that like 3-beer buzz crash where they're like, oh man, I need to really like go to bed now after I had a good evening with some buddies, where they can just sit for hours and have good conversations and just hang out and be relaxed and just kind of ride that. Does that kind of answer your question?
That does. Yeah. I mean, I got lots of surrounding questions. I mean, does it depend on, I would assume, the dosage, the kind of marijuana somebody is smoking, maybe what about different body types, or is it kind of like alcohol? Like you get a guy who 250 pounds, who's in really good shape, his metabolism's through the roof. I mean, he can probably drink a beer an hour for 12 hours and never feel, like that's not where you take somebody else who, might have the opposite effect. So do you have similarities with marijuana where different body types, different, well, I guess there's two questions: body types, persons, versus also the type of marijuana that somebody might be ingesting or inhaling?
Yeah, those are really good questions. It's kind of yes to all of them, where yeah, different strains of marijuana have different effects. The studies are really early in this, just because it's been legalized in Canada a little bit longer than the States, but there hasn't been a huge amount of studies, so most of it's anecdotal, which to me is still pretty good evidence, even if you can't be relied on totally. But yeah, the different strains do different things. Some of them calm you more, some of them amp you up more. And the body type is, it's way more complicated than alcohol. It's not necessarily just a metabolism issue, because cannabis attaches neurologically instead of just kind of working chemically. Sorry, I'm trying to simplify stuff.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Because it does attach to your cannabinoid receptors, and it's a neurological process more than alcohol.
Okay.
It really kind of depends on how your brain is built, and now that's getting into kind of science that we just don't have. We know that it affects different people completely differently, and there's lots of speculation on why that is, but it's not like I can say, hey, Preston, you've got this certain body type, you act in a certain way, and I think that pot's going to affect you this way. We just can't say that.
It's hard to predict.
It's impossible to predict.
Okay.
It completely differs by person, completely.
So, I mean, back in my pre-Christian days, I did get high a few times, and to me, for me personally, it was a 0 to 60. It was, and I remember, I don't know how much of this I should share. I remember, I remember driving, and I should not have been driving. I mean, I was like, whoo, like it was like I feel like I was like, yeah, it was almost not quite hallucinating, but close to it. Like I was like on the freeway, and I felt like I was in the back alley, and then I was in the back alley, and then I'm like, wait, I'm on the freeway. No, it's just, and then I remember being like, had this hyper panic attack, scared to death, that like all of a sudden like almost forgot how to drive. And then then I remember I think I was picking a buddy up from the train station or something. I remember sitting in the back alley in my car, staring at the alley. I think it might have been like 2.5 hours, just literally staring there, like kind of like in the movies, where you see people tripping. And I was like, all of a sudden I kind of woke up, and like I'm literally staring at this trash can for 2 hours, and I was fascinated just like, and it's almost like the alley kept changing almost scenes, but it wasn't. Anyway, I was like, oh my gosh, this, and I don't even know, I don't even remember how much I was. I never remember in the few times I might be smoked pot maybe 6 times or something. I never remember that kind of like in between state. For me, it was, but maybe I smoked too much. I don't know, like, or maybe back then it was just way more powerful, whatever, or could that be a common experience from people, where for some people it is either high or you're not high, and the second you start smoking a joint, then you're going to go to being impaired really quickly. Is that true, that some people, it may act like that on certain people, or is it not really? Is that more rare than it is common?
No, I would say those are really good observations, and I think that's a good comment. That yeah, some people, it's absolutely going to blow them out of the water immediately. Okay. But there's a lot of complexity that leads into that. So, for example, do you remember how you took it? Like, did you smoke a joint?
Just smoking a joint, yeah. Or
yeah,
maybe
just smoking a joint.
I can't remember. Yeah, it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly.
I never have done like an edible or something.
Okay. Yeah. So then, in that perspective, if you smoke a really high THC joint, which, by the way, pot is way more potent now than it used to be.
It
was 20 years ago. Yeah, they just keep upping the strains and the THC. But there's also variability. So when you smoke a joint, it goes into your lungs, which means it's absorbed immediately into your system. So you get the hit like this.
Okay.
When you drink alcohol, like if you have, let's say, a beer after you've mowed the lawn, you're hot, you haven't had a drink of water in a while, you're getting ready for supper, and you drink a beer, that hits you, and you get that buzz right away, right? If you drink a beer after dinner, when you've had food and everything like that, it takes a long time for that alcohol to be absorbed into your system. So you get a much longer, slower buzz. So it's going to be the same thing with how you ingest cannabis. Are you taking an edible? Is it a low THC? Is it 2% or something like that? And you ingest it. Well, you're probably actually not going to feel any effects for like half an hour. And then it's going to like slowly come in, and you're going to ride that just like that beer, and then it's slowly going to come down. If you're packing a pipe with high THC or even mid-level THC cannabis, and you take a hit of that, it's going to be a lot of THC immediately hitting your bloodstream, and so you're immediately way up here and then slowly coming down instead of a slow kind of going. Does that make sense?
It does. And having food, because I know more about the alcohol, food, and I didn't realize what is the hot weather? You mentioned a couple times with alcohol. Is it just because you're a little more dehydrated and that has
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
totally.
okay.
It just you're dehydrated, and I mean, just from personal experience too, that
Yeah.
doing exactly what I just said, right?
Yeah.
You're like, oh man, this is beautiful weather. Oh boy, I'm half a beer and I feel like I've had four, even though
Yeah,
I
yeah.
haven't.
So
It is. It's just a dehydration and how fast it hits your body, because your body, if it's at all dehydrated, goes, I need liquid, and so it's going to absorb. It's going to prioritize that absorption, and it's going to hit you fast.
so it's so the because I've heard this more anecdotally. So it is true that having food in your stomach and being hydrated, both of those will curb some of the effects of alcohol. Like it won't hit
Oh,
you as
100%.
oh, okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yep.
Okay.
And it really just comes down to simply the body's digestion. It's not just the beer that it's digesting. It's digesting all sorts of stuff. So
Right.
it just limits how
Okay.
fast it can hit your bloodstream.
And I think a huge thing that I've noticed anecdotally is when you're in really good shape, like if you go to the gym for a couple hours and you just worked out really hard, your metabolism is just raging. I feel like it just processes. I mean, it's almost like it feels the same as food. Like if you know, you eat 4 slices of pizza after you worked out for 2 hours on leg day, I mean, that's going to burn up pretty quickly rather than, you're out of shape and you throw down some pizza. It just kind of sits in there for a long time. And I've noticed this like with if I have a beer or something when I'm in good shape, it's like you don't feel anything really. But like if you're
Yeah.
super out of shape, it's like, yeah, I need to take this one slow.
Yeah.
Um, so with THC or especially inhaling marijuana, like food in your system, dehydration, none of that's really related, right? Because we're dealing now with neurological responses rather than is it gastrological, or you're not dealing with your digestive system, your metabolism processing it, right? So it's a completely different experience.
Yes and no, and that's where it comes back to how are you ingesting the THC? Is it going to be through an edible that you took and you're on an empty stomach?
Okay.
It's gonna mirror the effects of alcohol. Sorry, let me rephrase that. It's going to mirror the intake of alcohol
Okay.
in your system, where it's going to be a lot slower if you eat it with a meal. If you eat it on empty stomach, it's gonna hit you faster, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, if you're smoking it, it's not going to matter what you have in your gut, because
Okay.
you're ingesting it through your lungs.
Right. Okay. It is. I forgot what Todd said. I totally forgot what he said about this. Is THC, is it addictive, like chemically addictive? I always grew up hearing while alcohol and obviously some harder drugs and even caffeine can be chemically addictive, marijuana is not. And I forgot what Todd said about that. What do we know about the science behind that? Is it chemically addictive, or is he maybe that category is even more complex than even a yes or no answer?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, yes, but uh, and this is where kind of the wisdom side comes in for me,
Mhm.
is where yeah, THC can be addictive. So can alcohol.
Yeah,
So can caffeine.
caffeine. Yeah.
So can food. So can TV. So can sex. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
It's all addictive. It's not necessarily. Uh, things that come from outside your body that are in. So for me, when I think about these topics and what wisdom means in terms of cannabis use and alcohol use, that's a really important um, conversation for me. Where does kind of like a good robust theology of pleasure and a good robust theology of addiction, and those in my mind are very intertwined. What does that mean? So one of the things Todd said that I again gently took issue with was he did bring up the verse that, hey, so, have a glass of wine or have some wine because it makes the heart glad, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't unpack that, and I went, yeah, yes, let's pull those strings, because I feel like those strings and where that goes really should inform our cannabis use, not whether it's super addictive, not whether
Okay. Yeah.
does that make sense?
Well,
So
I think it would be inconsistent for people to or making a lot of money can be addictive. I mean, playing a slot
yeah,
machine, there so many anything that gives you any kind of dopamine. Having a cell phone, highly addictive. Social
yes.
media and so on and so on. So I'm hearing you say that that's just part of living life with our pleasure centers in our brain. Is we live in a pool of possible addictions. So either we just kind of take them all as seriously as we should, or kind of learn how to navigate through wisdom, you know, adequate uses of pleasure, and being careful not to, not to let things overcome us or enslave us.
And that's exactly it. Todd said something. Why are you using it? What are you using it for? And he focused on the medical side, the
Mm,
recreational medical side of the cannabis. But I think it does go deeper than that. Where um, if I come home from work, I work a stressful job, had a bad day, saw some bad stuff. Am I grabbing that beer because I
mm,
want to feel pleasure to hide from the crap that I'm feeling? Or am I grabbing that beer to, because I'm like, man, no, I actually, yes, it was a hard day, but uh, I feel fulfilled by that. Like, yes, there's goods and bad, but I'm grabbing this to just
mhm,
enjoy that I'm home. In my mind, it's the same thing with THC, and there shouldn't really be any difference. Is, man, am I smoking this joint because like a lot of my friends, they go camping. They won't do it all year long, but they'll go camping, and it's replaced drinking when they're out. They'll just sit around a campfire and
mhm,
grab an edible. Are they doing that because they're in a social situation where they can kind of chill and they can relax, they can enjoy the outdoors, they can enjoy good conversation, or are they doing it because they're going camping to escape from life and they
mm,
need the drugs to do that?
mm.
That's, even without the impairment, even if you're not impaired by the THC or alcohol or whatever else it is, that to me is the defining line. And why are you using it?
Mhm, mhm. No, that's good, and it is even that, that's a fine line too, like,
Yeah.
the unhealthy escape versus the other, like, versus I had a hard day and I'm gonna do something, whether it's I'm gonna make a nice meal, I'm gonna listen to some great music, there's
Yes.
so many things we do that kind of help compensate, some of the difficulties in life, and I don't know too many thoughtful Christians who would say any kind of like seeking of some kind of pleasure from God's creation is intrinsically bad if you feel enjoyment about over something. So I guess I'm still kind of so yeah. The- and I don't know what question I'm at. Like, what percentage of people in your anecdotal experience are the kinds of people that could experience healthy forms of enjoyment from smoking a joint, ingesting an edible versus kind of this getting sideways. Another thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on that kind of related is for some reason I feel like I keep hearing so many, maybe not, dozens, but enough stories of people ingesting an edible, usually out of good motives, like for it's like a medical use or whatever, and just having a horrible, like violent trip.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, I could there's one scenario in particular years ago. I mean, it was so scary, what happened, and I've heard that like sometimes they put crazy amounts of THC, maybe accidentally, or maybe just maybe the guy putting the THC in edibles on an edible and is making a bad judgment call. I don't know. It just seems like there's something with these edibles that's just like you're just kind of seems like you're kind of rolling the dice a little bit. So all that to say, yeah, um, is it like a small percentage, or would you say a majority of people that could ingest or inhale, you know, a certain level of THC and not end up fully impaired?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard because I kind of have, with my job and the people that I interact with, a little bit of confirmation bias. So I have to like fight back against that, and I'm not 100% sure if I land in the right spot. So I'll kind of give you my observations and opinion, but please take that with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as people being able to use THC and not be impaired, to use it recreationally in the same way as casual alcohol use, I don't know what the percentage is, because I almost often see it misused at work. All right, at
You
my
do?
job as
Okay.
a police
Yeah.
officer. But that's because inherently I'm going to get called if somebody's
Right.
misusing
Right.
it
Right.
and
Yeah.
doing stupid stuff, right? But so on the flip side, I try to balance that with my personal experience, where I know lots of friends who use it once a month, or use it during the summertime when they're out and about and they want to enjoy the summer, and then they don't use it all winter long. And then I also have friends that maybe use it a little bit more than they should. Same as alcohol. So again, in my mind, it really does mirror alcohol use as a wisdom issue, and it's
Okay.
hard to point to exact numbers on that. It's really almost more of a relational issue. It's like, hey man, yeah, you've been using a lot of edibles lately, and it's starting to concern me, and I can have that conversation with somebody, but I don't even know if the science you could have behind that. It's like drinking. It's like, oh man, my brother, you know and I'm just saying this hypothetically. My brother and my friend had, um, I had some drinks, and they started drinking more. At what point, from a third party perspective, did it
Yeah.
go from being casual use to not? I don't know. It's hard to say. Does that kind of answer that part of your
Well, it
question?
does. So we spent a lot. My wife's from France. We spent a lot of time in France and Europe, and there's other cultures like France where, I mean, people are having a glass of wine or two with the meal every day, sometimes for lunch and dinner. It's like
Not a
it's
big
just not
deal.
even a big
It's
deal. It's just such a
Yeah.
part of the culture, and it's such a part of the food and the life and the. So I mean, there's even some cultural things here. Like, is that okay? So having 2 glasses of wine a day, every day for your whole life. I mean, Andrew Huberman would say you're killing your brain, but have you listened to that?
Yeah, I've listened to some of his stuff. He's overall pretty good, but he's a little. You know what? It actually, it's a really good point, and something to bring in is that I feel like, because of our cultural biases, we overemphasize science, and we go, oh man, there's this study that shows this is bad and this is bad, and we go, that's the end of the story. When like you just said, there's whole cultures that do all sorts of stuff that the science says is terrible for you, and they're actually really healthy people,
Yeah,
and there's no issues with that. So I feel
yeah.
like the hard science studies are important, but anecdotal evidence, in my mind, is actually just as important, and we need to figure out how to marry some of that stuff together. So
Hmm.
specifically on this conversation with cannabis, we do have a culture that's very, historically, we've got a few generations that's anti-cannabis. It's no, that's an entry-level drug. You're going to be doing meth next week if you smoke a joint today, right? And so there's a lot of cultural bias against that. And so I feel like that creeps into some of these conversations, where we do need to step back and think, if this wasn't cannabis, this is another chemical that you can take and it doesn't impair, what would our result on that conversation be? Would it be, no, this is still really bad? Or would it be,
Yeah,
well, actually, if we're looking at this from a different perspective that's outside our culture, what is the issue? And
yeah.
that's kind of where I've fallen on that, is friends drink wine or a few times a day and there's no issue. So
Yeah, well, I'm as a parallel, like, what if somebody, was smoking pot recreationally, wasn't getting impaired, they got a joint after lunch, sometimes maybe one after dinner, 6 days a week. Like, most of us listen, you're like, dude, I'm not down with that. Even if,
and
what,
I
what if
wouldn't
everything you're saying is
personally
correct?
be.
What if everything you're saying is correct, and there could be some just maybe cultural barriers here that aren't
Yeah.
actual. They're more just situational. Um, and what is our actual argument for why that is wrong, if, in light of what you said about the addictive thing is complicated, like everything can be potentially addictive. Also, what if they're not actually getting impaired, what is the argument against it? We just just don't like
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. And that's kind of where I came to on this is, for me, it's, I might try it someday. Again, I'm like, clearly I'm not against it, but
Mhm.
for me, I have other pleasures. We have stuff as a family. Like, I have a family, um, it's never probably going to be a big part of my life because there's other pleasures that I choose with other people that I can't really have a joint, or I don't feel like that would benefit my family and relationships and my personality if I'm going out and having an edible on a regular basis. It does last longer in your system than alcohol, and I typically am very, very conservative just because of what I see
Yeah.
on any type of impairment when driving, right? And that's just a personal choice. It's actually not a scientific thing or whatsoever. It's just a personal thing. I try to pull myself farther back than I actually think is right.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And let me give a disclaimer now, because I get all excited when I just interact with ideas. I have not smoked marijuana since I was, I think, 19 years old. I have no desire to do it. Probably will never do it, even if it's like, even if it becomes kind of the new drinking, where it's like, yeah, every elders meeting, toss around a joint, like like you do in some churches where you got craft beer on tap in some of these churches. So I don't, again, I don't have it. I just don't have any desire, interest in it. So I'm not advocating for it, nor am I like trying to make room for me to like go, buy a bong after this podcast or something. So,
and I'm
I
with
think
you. I
makes you and
actually echo
I
that.
guess, good people who can talk about this on more of an idea level, because I don't think there's any personal motivation here. What about the health benefits or problems with marijuana use? Like if somebody did, okay, so I guess, we reference Andrew Huberman, who's a famous, like, I don't know what he's a neurobiologist or
Yeah,
something,
neuro.
and he
Yeah,
had
something.
he's kind of, and is one of the most popular podcasters out there. Really brilliant guy, deals a lot with like just health and fitness and supplements, like just super thorough. And he had this like 2 hour long episode of alcohol where the dude
Yep.
pretty much did more for like sobriety in America than like he was saying, like, excessive drinking, which he defined like more than one drink a week or something, like is actually deteriorating your, I mean, it was both my wife listened to that. We're like, all right, we're not drinking next year, which we haven't stuck to, but I mean, we're like, oh my gosh, this is so all that to say, like, even what we would consider very, very responsible, moderate use of alcohol, I would say maybe there's mixed results on what that does to your body, but at least for Huberman and others, it actually is not super healthy. Neither is bacon every morning, and we can go on, with food and stuff.
Yep.
But prolonged, let's just say responsible, um, non-impairing use of THC, does that have? What do you know about the effects it has on the body and your health?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's honestly something that I need to do some more research into. What I do know is that while the brain is developing, like prior to 25, it does have significant effects. So, again, depending on your neurochemistry and how it affects you, one joint when you're 14 may have some serious implications. Definitely, ongoing use is going to have some implications when you're in your brain development. Now, in the science that I've seen, again, I haven't done a deep dive into this, so take this with a grain of salt. Over that, the science is really hit and miss.
Okay.
And this is where I go back to, and I likely won't do a deep dive because my kind of outlook on this is, okay. So there's a study that I'm citing off the top of my head. I'd have to look up to get details, but it's out there. Anybody can find it. The study of this, it's not a new one, of this community down somewhere in the States, kind of a more closed, like ethnic community. And they did everything they're not supposed to. They drank every day. They smoked. They ate bacon every morning. They all these preserves and everything. And this was studied because nobody in that community had like heart disease and like all these serious illnesses. And they're like, but you're doing everything that should cause heart disease. What the crap is going on? And then eventually there was some fractures in that community, and it split off. And guess what? Tons of people started having heart disease and all of these massive issues. So it's kind of to me, that's a good indicator that science that shows something is really good for you or really bad for you needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And our bodies are insanely complicated. We really are in the dark ages when it comes to how our brains and our bodies interact. We can't, yes, read it, understand it, but should we be looking at this from a perspective of, does pot damage our brains or hurt us long term? I think the bigger question is, well, why are you using that every day?
Okay.
it does that seem wise? Because to me, smoking pot 2 times a day, 3 times a day, even if your each individual instance may be wise, I feel like as a whole, maybe you should check that out because that's not our culture. If I was here drinking a couple glasses of wine every day, my wife would probably have a conversation with me. If I went over to France, we would both do it, and we wouldn't
Right.
think 2 seconds of it, right? So why are we doing that? Are we is this a community? Is this a culture that we're a part of?
Mm.
And we're not noticing some serious side effects long term, or yeah, it does come down to a context and a wisdom issue, I feel. And science, well important, should not be the be all and
Mhm.
end all. Does that make sense?
I heard that, yeah, that study, it's ringing a bell. Well, wasn't the point of that study that human connection
Yes.
was like the most like that actually is the most healthy thing you can do, and people that aren't connected, if they're maybe drinking the same amount as that group and then eating bacon, with like doing all the same habits, but if they're isolated, lonely, stressful, disconnected from community, like that had a horrible effect on their body, whereas their
Yes.
social connections, that's fascinating. That's super fascinating. So, and
Yeah.
which might be why certain cultures that maybe have a higher on average alcohol intake, like France and others, and in Germany and other, like they
Yep.
have this rich social connection that alcohol plays a role in. Maybe that's why
Yes.
they're living much more healthier lives than we would expect.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder the same thing. And for pot use, then, if you're out recreationally smoking a joint or having some edibles, and that's your connection time, and it's not a hey, let's together and party and get gooned because I don't want to remember and I want to do that with
Yeah.
friends, but yeah, they actually are chilling. Like I've said a few times here, I
Hmm.
maybe they're doing that 3 or 4 times a week. I don't know if I'd have a problem with that. Again, that's not my jam. I wouldn't do
Mhm.
that. But man, that's the
Hmm.
connection. They've got some rhythms there. I would
Hmm.
say that maybe that's we could learn something from that.
I wonder. I don't think going back to Andrew Huberman. Like I wonder if I don't remember him even taking that into account. Some of the sociological, it was very much all chemical body,
Yes.
just all those, just strictly kind of what it does to your body directly. But I don't think those studies were mitigated with some of these other cultural factors. Anyway, we don't need to keep
Yeah.
bringing him in. I was,
He's an
yeah,
interesting guy.
I was bummed out at that episode. Really, I'm like, sheesh.
Yeah. Now, you also asked a question a little while ago about kind of the extreme interactions that you had maybe had a friend or an
Yeah,
acquaintance or
yeah,
something like that
yeah. Are you
that had an
noticing that with
extreme.
edibles in particular?
Yeah. So typically, again, this is more of my observational evidence combined with my training. So again, there is some confirmation bias here. So, but I feel like I am exposed to a lot of it, so I can speak with some authority on it. Typically, those experiences are the equivalent of a blackout drunk. It's an overdose, the THC overdose.
Okay.
Um, and your body just reacts differently. You can react really violently.
Mhm.
It is interesting how um, there is a culture, like Todd was saying in his episode, where we go, oh no, it just chills the people out and there's no issues.
Mhm.
Well, no, when you overdose, all sorts of things can go funny, and that really is up to your brain chemistry and
Okay.
your individual person. Some people just sit there and they lie on the floor and they stare at the ceiling for 6 hours,
Mhm.
but other people can get super violent, and
Mm.
it's totally unpredictable.
Okay.
But typically, it has to do with two things. It's either an overdose, or I guess three things: an overdose, or you have a brain chemistry that interacts with THC even at lower levels in that way, or it's poly drug use. So you're actually 10 beers in and you smoked a joint and you took a hoot of cocaine, like it's
Mm, mm,
and then suddenly you fly off the rails.
okay.
So in my job, poly drug use is typically the primary thing that I see,
Mhm,
where people will go into a situation and will have to arrest somebody for their own safety and for everybody else's because they're going nuts and destroying everything.
mm,
And all their friends will say, "Oh no, no, no! They just smoked a joint."
mm,
And I can clearly see from my drug training, I'm like, "So you're also on meth?" Like I can see, and just nobody else wants to say that because they don't want to admit that everybody was, using a little bit of meth on the side, right?
yeah.
But every once in a while, you run into somebody, and I'm like, I actually think legit, they're they just are having a really bad trip and they're
Uh,
probably overdosing. I think it's a little bit different in Canada with the THC dosing in edibles. Because what can happen is um, you have an edible and then it goes half an hour goes by, and you're like, I'm not feeling anything. I'm gonna have another edible and another half
mm,
hour, and you're like, oh, I'm starting to feel it, but not much. And you have another edible, and suddenly you've had like ridiculous amounts, but it's not going to hit you fully for another hour.
uh,
And so that happens on a semi-regular basis.
okay.
Down in the States, because a lot of it's unregulated and it's some Joe in his garage that's measuring it out with, stuff he got from this pharmacy. Here in Canada, we have the benefit where you go into, the pot store, the cannabis store, and you say, I want 1%, and it's right there. Oh, there's 2% gummies. Here's the THC that's this much, and it's very regulated. You
Okay.
know that you are getting that much, and that's just what it is. It's no different than alcohol percentages.
Okay.
You know you're getting it, and it's a lot safer as long as you don't take 5 gummies because you're impatient.
Right, 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 right. Well, so for medical, this is going back to my conversation with Todd, where to me the line got a little fuzzy, and I think he, saw it too. What determines medical use? You
Mm,
know, okay, I broke my leg, and instead of taking Vicodin, I'm gonna take some prescribed edibles. Okay, most people either they're against Vicodin and marijuana, or they're being inconsistent, I think, and saying, no, this, yes, this, no, Okay, but we're all pretty much on board with that kind of medical use. What about like curbing anxiety? What, what about, like I've got a very high stressful job slash ministry slash life. Like, I could probably easily go into a doctor and get a prescription if I wanted to for anxiety levels and stress and lack of sleep and waking up throughout the night and like I'm sure but like what constitutes you have okay, yes, you have a level of anxiety that now it would be medical use versus no, you just had a kind of a stressful day and this isn't medical use, this is just recreational. Like to me, that line is just so fuzzy. Like when
yeah.
people say yes, medical use, no recreational use. Do you yeah, what are your thoughts on that? Do you see that same fuzziness or
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of debate in that because that opens up this huge can of worms in kind of drug use. And so I don't know how big the harm reduction model is in the States. Have you heard of the harm reduction kind of
it
model of
sounds
addiction?
familiar, but even if I haven't
So,
heard of it doesn't mean it's not big. I'm yeah, I've got a
okay, fair enough.
pretty
Yeah,
narrow
and I don't
understanding.
know. I know it's big in Canada because it was kind of developed on Vancouver's East Hastings here in Canada.
Mm,
Again, it's more complicated. I'll just leave it at that.
yeah.
With the idea is that you've got addicts that aren't necessarily at the spot that understand or can admit that, oh man, I need help, even though I've been living on the street for 5 years. I'm desperately addicted to opioids and I need them 8 times a day. You have to be at a certain spot where you go, man, I am really done and I will do anything it takes to get away from this. I still can't, I'm an addict. I can't actually choose not to use that at this point, but I need to be done at whatever it takes.
Mhm.
And in order to beat an addiction, you have to have supports, the right supports at a certain time when you make that decision, or you tend to just slip into another cycle and then you come back around and you're right at that point. So the harm reduction model recognizes that, basically says, what if we actually quasi support that addiction by keeping them as healthy as they can, by providing some subsidized housing, clean needles, not the drug itself, but although some people actually would go that far, and in order to keep them alive and as healthy as we can to the point where they can reach their own decision, and in order to find help. And so that harm reduction model is trickled down
Okay.
to what you're talking about, where hey, I'm just experiencing some anxiety here. And so we'll prescribe, anti-anxiety medications, which have a whole host of side effects. And doctors are starting to
Yeah.
recognize, well, actually, pot does a lot of the same things for certain people, not for everybody. Um, and and we can give it to them and reduce anxiety. So in my mind, if we do kind of subscribe to that harm reduction model a little bit, which has some pros and
Mhm.
cons, if you're experiencing a whole bunch of anxiety from your job, um, and you go and get some pot, what else are you doing to actually fix the problem
Right.
and to actually get healthy? Because if you're using the pot to be able to enable a lifestyle that's not biblical, that doesn't have good rest and Sabbath in it,
Right.
well, you're just creating an addiction because you're never going to be able to function without it.
Right.
And so I actually personally have no problems at all if people want to go to the doctor and use pot for anxiety, with the caveat that they had better be getting like actually sorting out what is the underlying issue of your anxiety, because you can't just keep using pot for 40 years to help with your anxiety. What is the underlying cause, and fix that,
Mm.
so that you can actually stop using it. You almost use it as a crutch, right?
Mm.
You just need to get through a certain time. You need to be able to function for a while in order to get healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the intention that this is going to be a short-term thing. So in my mind, that would be a wise medical use
Yeah.
of drugs.
Because I mean, yeah. So again, I don't know much about the different medications and stuff, but from what I've heard, some, if not a lot of the anti-anxiety medication people take or antidepressants or whatever, like versus marijuana. I mean, it seems like of the healthier choice, marijuana, and maybe even
Yeah.
least addictive. I don't know. Like I've at least heard that it's, if we're okay with anxiety medication, antidepressants, which most people would be okay. Again, like you said, as a temporary measure, as a way to,
Yeah.
figure out your life or get through a season or something. But if there's deep core issues in your life that need to be changed, which typically that's what's causing, the anxiety, then we need to address those alongside taking temporary measures.
Yes.
But just in looking at the temporary measures, it seems like, again, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, but marijuana might be the healthier of some of the options that are well accepted in
Yeah, I
society.
would agree with that 100%. Like even from my training, what some of those anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications do to your brain, like at a really fundamental level, that some of it, from the limited science that I've seen, well, not limited, from the science that I've seen, we don't know how to reverse, even though the brain is really has the ability to fix itself. It's catastrophic what we're doing with a lot of these drugs long term, where I don't see that from cannabis. Again, I might take this back in 5 years, but
Yeah.
I 100% would rather to try, if I had a surgery or something, try a joint than
Mm,
6 weeks of like Oxycontin.
mm,
100%. But that's also, it's not cut and dry, because I know people that have used marijuana post op. They were like, I don't want to use the opioids. This stuff's awful. And the pot worked really well. They were high for 3 weeks, and until the pain went away,
yeah.
and which really was any different than taking oxys or fentanyl, right?
Mhm,
You're high the entire time, so you don't feel
yeah.
the pain. But I've talked to other people that have tried it, and they're like, it did not dull my pain whatsoever. It didn't work for me, and that's where the variability comes into effect. Where,
Mm,
yeah, sure, try it, but it's not going to work for everybody. It's not like some of the harder designer drugs.
interesting. What is it a totally different cat? Because I mean, you deal with people, on many different types of drugs, low level, high level, illegal, legal, whatever. What about on the other side, kind of like Ritalin or stuff that treats, I guess, would treat ADHD typically, something like that.
Yeah.
It in that category of medication, is that just a form of speed? I mean, is it like a low dose of cocaine? Is it part of the same plant and stuff? Because I've heard that there's a really high percentage of people that are on some kind of like low doses of speed, largely to treat kind of ADHD type stuff. This is all new to me.
Yeah,
So
that's 100% correct.
really
And yeah, and it's not cocaine, they're amphetamines. So
amphetamines.
essentially
Okay.
they're a slightly different chemical compound that's very, very similar but different from methamphetamine.
Okay.
Methamphetamine would be hard. Down in the States, in some states, it's actually legal to prescribe methamphetamine clinically for ADHD, because the
Really?
problem,
Oh,
because we have kind of a medicated society, I would say, we just, there's a problem, throw a pill at it. I have massive issues with this, and that's a
yeah.
whole other conversation. But what we've done, like neurologically, is especially as your brain is developing. Okay, so you've got ADHD, rather than treat the symptoms, or maybe say, hey, maybe our school systems are actually some of the issue here, and it's actually not how our brain is functioning. We don't look at it that way, and we go, we need to shove everybody in the same. They need to be similar. This person has ADHD, and please don't anybody hear me wrong that I'm saying that I'm making some blanket statements here that have exceptions. But we're prescribing ADHD medication, and as the kids grow, the brains are adapting, and they go, oh, I actually don't need to create the chemicals that this is fulfilling the place of anymore. And then when their body, as it tries to reach homeostasis, because every time we use drugs, it's always trying to reach our normal, our individual normal, it actually creates less and less of whatever the amphetamines are filling the gap of, which means we have to use more of the amphetamines to actually control the ADHD. So now we're a generation or two in of just medicating everything, and Ritalin doesn't work anymore in a lot of cases because we keep upping and upping and upping. So now we're going, well, we have something else. It's methamphetamine. Why don't we give methamphetamine to kids, and it'll help with their ADHD? And it's actually becoming quite prevalent down in the States. Not here yet, as far as I know. But yeah, it's very dangerous.
Is Ritalin one of many different kinds of? Is that kind of that's just like the brand of this same chemical that is probably goes under a lot of different labels? Or
yeah, that's exactly. It's like the Kleenex is a tissue, and Ritalin is an amphetamine type thing. So there's lots of different brands and slightly different chemical compounds, to be honest, that all try to accomplish the same thing: speed the brain up so that if you're on ADHD, you can focus on all the things your brain wants to focus on, and then actually focus on what you want to. And again, that's kind of, I'm not an expert on that one. I have friends that have ADHD, and that's how they described it to me, combined with what I know about drugs.
Can you, if you're around somebody who's, again, smoking, has THC in their system, is not totally high and debilitated, can you tell? Like, are there certain signs that you can see? Like, oh yeah, you're totally functional or whatever, but I could tell you've had a joint recently. Or is there really no signs? If they're functional, there's no real signs.
Yeah, there is. And it all depends. Obviously, the more drug, the more physiological signs I can see. But it's funny, one of the big ones for me is pupil size.
Okay.
So depending on which drug you're on, your pupils can actually get way bigger than they should be at a certain light level, or way smaller than they should be. So if you're on a drug that either depresses you or like an opioid that really slows your brain function down, people who are on opioids will be in the middle of the night and they have pinpoint pupils because their body goes, whoa, I need less information here, and I can't function. So pinpoint pupils when they're high. With cannabis, it's actually typically dilated pupils. Not always. Again, it's kind of a wild card drug. It's typically dilated, and so it's funny. It'll be the middle of the day, and I'll talk to somebody. I'll be like, man, they're a little bit off. What's going on here? Oh man, like we're all pinpoint pupils because it's bright sun out, and they've got these huge dilated things. But again, it's also like just little decision making. It's a pauses in responses. You shouldn't have to think about that response, and that's starting to get into the impairment levels. It is very difficult, even though I can see some indicator at low levels when people use.
Okay. Well, Ryan, I should probably let you go. Thanks so much for the fascinating conversation. I wonder how many emails I'm going to get from this one. I feel like I need another disclaimer. I am not advocating the ingestation nor the what's the other, inhalement or whatever of THC or Ritalin or whatever else, cocaine. I don't know how many drugs we covered today. So yeah, this is just a way of engaging in an informative conversation so we can think better about this important topic. So thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.